Hello, welcome to a special edition of The Middle Ground. I figured you all were getting tired of staring at my bookcase. So I have a more fun, relaxed interaction with you today. Sometimes I've done some videos in the past that are just kind of for fun, reactions to things. But I did want to talk about this film that was released last summer. The Strait Guys is by a friend, Rick Minnich. I wanted to make sure we got his name in here. So there it is. I met Rick, as American documentary director in Berlin. I met him in 2016 through the Ivy Circle. He is an alumni of Columbia, but moved here very young. He's been a lot of fun to know over the last 7 years. I met him in 2016. He was well into this project. It was a passion project for him, but it was also a couple of years before he spent all summer in the Arctic filming this project. And so I've heard a lot about this project through the last several years of knowing Rick. And it was actually funded largely or in part by MDR here in Leipzig, which is a big media company. And through that funding, a lot of his crew members were from Mitteldeutschland, so a lot of crew members from here in Leipzig who I've had the pleasure of meeting. And I'm so pleased that his project has finally produced a successful film. He's finally wrapped up this long passion project of his for the last 10 years or so. And really pleased that he's released it. And it was a pleasure to attend last night's viewing in Leipzig with the cast, with the crew, production crew, and really enjoyed the evening talking with documentary directors. Very supportive in terms of my nonfiction project and my work in political analysis. So the reason I particularly found this film interesting because I come from a geopolitical and economic development background and experience. And from that point of view, these guys were a little clueless. And so this film is obviously told for this passion project of these guys. The story is about the dream of having a rail tunnel under the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia. And so the lead railway engineer who has been trying to motivate and create this vision for the last several decades, and this story is about him, was a man from communist Czech Republic. I guess it wasn't the Czech Republic at the time, during the USSR, left Czech Republic, his home, to go to the US as a young adult with his wife. And so since the mid-'80s has thought about this particular project in terms of peacemaking venture. The idea in the current political climate of connecting Russia and the United States is terrifying to me. I know what Russia does with their railway bridge to Crimea in transporting tanks and weapons there. So the idea of Russia having a railway entry into Alaska at this moment in geopolitical history is not my favorite idea. However, from the background of economic development, because there's a lot of trade route logistics that could be done trans-Pacific, and my grandfather was a test engineer for Boeing who designed a lot of the long flight paths. So I do have an understanding and background of the importance of innovating in these areas to connect places. My grandfather was responsible for helping design the transcontinental flight paths, the transatlantic flight paths, and when he died in a test crash for Boeing, was in the process of designing trans-Pacific flight paths. One of his best friends from the Marine pilot group that he was a part of was Pappy Boyington. He was a well-known fighter pilot during World War II. There was a TV show made about Pappy Boyington in the 20th century called Baba Black Sheep. And my grandparents and Pappy Boyington and his wife were extremely close. They all lived in this kind of West Coast Pacific area. My grandfather was traveling to Hawaii a lot as part of his efforts in this trans-Pacific flight path. So I can understand importance of innovation connecting trans-Pacific logistics lines. And these guys who have this vision are clearly experts in the rail industry, which I know nothing about rail. So they did get a younger rail specialist who is born in the United States, who has experience working with politics and PPA projects, who could understand a little bit more about some of the strategy involved. However, for me, I thought, well, that was a great place to start. So they went to Alaska to discuss the economic development advantages for connecting Alaska by rail and connecting Alaska and Russia by rail. And it could potentially bring a lot of economic growth to the western Alaskan coast. And those are all arguments I can understand. However, it felt like they were trying to go from the top down in terms of their vision being so grandiose of this tunnel is then going to connect all the way to South America on the east side, and on the west side it's going to go all the way down to India, and you're going to connect India up through Alaska into Canada and United States and all the way down to South America. And to do this, we need all the support from all of these different countries. This is going to lead to world peace. And I thought when they went to Alaska, the way to build up the demand is to start with small goals. Start by connecting Alaska by rail. Start by creating a ferry from the west coast of Alaska to the island in the middle of the Bering Strait, where there are two islands on either side of the international border, one on the Russian side and one on the US side. So you can start with ferries, right? Ferries are a precursor to demonstrating that rail as a transportation pathway would be needed. So in my mind, ferries are a precursor to rail tunnels. Scotland has ferries all over the remote islands. There's not necessarily high enough traffic to demand car or rail tunnels, or there are some bridges to some of the islands, but there's a lot more ferries and are connecting all of those different individual microeconomies. Even Great Britain and France didn't start by building a tunnel. I mean, if you had started 100 years ago telling them, hey, you're fairly recently in the last couple of 100 years, these countries have still been at war. I mean, 100 years ago, French and the British still have a rivalry. That's not just 100 years ago. But to say 100 years ago, they should have started with a tunnel versus they started with a ferry, and then demand grew around transportation between these two countries. Trade grew. And then there was a demand for a tunnel after the ferry had been around, getting overused, having population overstuffing in a ferry. Then they say, okay, we need this tunnel. We need to facilitate ease of transportation. And so in my mind, from a starting point, locally recognizing, they talk to some of these local communities about changing climates that decrease some of their resources that they're used to having to build their lifestyles. So just the expense of some of their living costs being extremely high because transportation is so difficult to some of those regions. So looking at for economic factors locally, saying what do these microeconomies need to adapt to changing environments, so adapt so their living costs aren't so high. What would facilitate those things locally is not a, a rail tunnel to Russia, but the port in Nome was just funded as part of Biden's infrastructure bill. A port is a trade hub, is a logistics hub, and so increasing the trade and the shipping logistics of that region, then increased demand for additional types of transportation infrastructure to be built. And that's a good step forward, that the Nome port will be expanded, and that's something the Biden infrastructure bill has approved. But that's the direction I would go from an economic standpoint, not starting with trying to get 15 countries on board with world peace when there's one of those major countries very ideologically opposed to peace with its neighbors. It's kind of definitely a cart in the horse situation. You can't have a rail tunnel to build world peace when one person on the end of it doesn't want it. Yeah. And it's sad because they do travel to Moscow and they have people in Russia on board with this, building this national rail connection line. And in 2014, I was working with some automotive distributors in Siberia on a national aftermarket automotive part distribution network. And I thought, the guy in Moscow that wants to create wars doesn't care about the efforts of these people to build these transcontinental national networks across Russia for economic growth. It's not his priority. And that's something you can be aware of when trying to have these conversations about this vision you want to work toward, saying, okay, there's a big piece of the puzzle that's not in place currently, instead of trying to say, oh, it doesn't matter, we'll continue forward with our endeavors and just get roadblocked by the person wanting to create war for our country. So it is sad that people with visions to network Russia in that 11 time zones across those continents do have these visions and do want to put in this effort to make these economic growth infrastructure possible, and it does keep getting waylaid. All of their efforts keep getting waylaid by the national governing agenda or priorities. So I'm watching this video with this group of people with this vision for all of those things in mind, thinking of that and knowing it's a real frustration, but knowing it's something that they could have been more aware of. I say that the way to plan a good, successful strategy forward is based on being in touch with how the reality, not necessarily the ideological vision for how you want the world to be. Because if you're making strategy and plans on how you want the world to be, you're always going to run into obstacles. But if you're taking into account, this is the way the world is, here are the obstacles, how do we create a strategy and a plan to adapt to the obstacles that exist in the real world, then you're building in that adaptability in your strategy and in your plan toward your goal. You have more adaptability to run into problems instead of saying, I need to move in this one direction toward this goal. It's the only path. Why do I keep running into a wall? Because that wall was part of what you missed with your ideological vision. So Yeah. And that's where all of those mechanisms in my brain were churning while watching these guys spin their wheels a little bit. So it was, but if you want to be inspired about the vision and then think, what are the foundational steps we can take toward it? Then watch this from inspiration. This gentleman whose life, this has been his life passion, his life vision, was older and running out of time. So I do recommend seeing the film. It's a very interesting story, great representation of the Inuit cultures in Alaska. Their priorities in this project I thought were very well done. So really proud of my friend Rick for this effort, for getting to the end of the road and achieving his goal of telling this story. So recommend go seeing this, their website, I'll link below so you can find ways to view this documentary. I believe they're putting together an hour-long package that they can then release to online streaming services. If you're interested, I'm sure there will be updates where you can watch this documentary film in the future. But thank you so much for joining me. That's my reaction, my response to the story of this vision they had and how they were going about it and how it fit into my activities, and thinking, of course, my gears in my head churning and thinking, that's not how I would do it. But really great time with the crew. Really appreciate their hospitality and look forward to more from Rick in the future. Thank you for joining me here at the Middle Ground. I hope to see you again soon.